Okay, this is our first lecture. We're going to be covering the period from Persia to Rome, this lost history. Much changes between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. The Bible does not tell us of the history, the things that happened over the 450 years between the last prophet, Malachi, and the first book that was written of what would become the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians or perhaps Galatians. We'll spend some time here filling in the gaps. Let's start out with the Persian period, which takes us from 539 to 332 BC, and first talk about the return from captivity and the reconstruction. So during their exile in Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire, who had absorbed Israel and Judah into their vast empire. 70 years after the exile had begun, King Cyrus of Persia sent an edict allowing any who desired to come and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple of Yahweh. This was carried out under the leadership of 4 men. Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, was named governor, and he led the reconstruction of the temple. He fades from the record shortly after, and no other descendants of David were named governor after him. Ezra was a careful student of the Old Testament writings and the law of Moses, and he led the people to renew their covenant with Yahweh and establish schools of teaching the law of Moses that led to the synagogue system. Nehemiah led in the reconstruction of the walls around Jerusalem and brought a revival in the economic and spiritual life of the people. Joshua served as high priest. Only a relatively small portion of the nation returned to Judah, the most pious. These had realized the foolishness of idolatry and were determined not to repeat the sins of their parents so that they would not suffer the same punishment. And we get into the idea of religious purity and the development of the Samaritans. The building of a people faithful to Yahweh was not an easy thing. Even though the people made a covenant with Yahweh to keep his law, they became negligent in giving tithes and in worship in general. They did not keep the Sabbath, nor did they abstain from mixed marriages. In the time of Malachi, even priests had fallen so low that the prophet had to correct them sharply for their sins and neglect. Part of the problem was the efforts of the surrounding non-Israelite peoples. They resisted the establishment of a purist Jewish people. The Jews rejected the request from the Samaritans to participate in the reconstruction of the temple, and this produced a strong enmity that continued in New Testament times and led the Samaritans to establish their own competing temple on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritan woman mentioned the ruins of this place of worship in her conversation with Jesus in John 4. And the high priest now became a new political post. The Persians were not willing to allow the reestablishment of the Davidic lineage, so the high priest became the highest-ranking official who answered directly to the Persian governor. This transformed the position of high priest into something much more political than it had ever been in the past, making it a political rather than a religious office. And let's move on to the Alexandrian period from 332 to 301 BC. First of all, let's talk about Alexander's vision. After the Battle of Issus, in which Darius III of Persia retreated to the east, the Macedonian king Alexander moved to secure Syria, Canaan, and Egypt before returning to face his primary enemy, Persia. He followed the footsteps of his father Philip of Macedonia, the warrior, and the counsel of his primary teacher, the famous philosopher Aristotle. Alexander proved to be a military genius. His immediate military goal was to avenge the Persian invasion under Xerxes, Ahasuerus, in the book of Esther. In the long run, his goal was cultural. He wanted to Hellenize the East. Aristotle had impressed on him the superiority of Greek thought and lifestyle, so Alexander tried to unify the world through Greek or Hellenistic culture. In his military campaigns, he was accompanied by philosophers and scientists. Wherever Alexander conquered, he established a Greek city with a hippodrome, which is a horse racetrack, a gymnasium, and a place of teaching. He gave his soldiers money and land in the conquered territory and encouraged them to marry local women and build a life in the conquered country. Alexander married a princess from each conquered country. Greek colonizers followed his army's conquests immediately. Alexander made a great effort to join East and West, and when he conquered the Persian Empire, he placed Persians in high administrative posts. One of the most important elements in the Hellenistic era is that common Greek, known as Koine Greek, was established as a universal language. For a period of about 600 years, the entire world from the Middle East to Europe could communicate in the same language. Jesus was born right in the middle of this 600-year period. That's why the missionary work of the first disciples was so greatly facilitated. Paul could minister in Arabia, Palestine, Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, and Italy without having to learn any of the local languages in these countries. This was due to the unifying vision of Alexander the Great. Let's talk about Israel under Alexander the Great. The land of Israel became a strategic bridge between Greece and Egypt. Given the Mediterranean Sea on the west and the impassable Arabian Desert to the east, the thin strip of land the Israelites called home was the only way to march troops from Europe and Asia to the Nile and Africa. Alexander's process of Hellenization was not violent. He never attacked local religions. He also did not demand to be worshipped as a god. Let's talk about the successors of Alexander the Great. Alexander died when he was just over 30 years old, and a long fight ensued between his generals for control of the kingdom. 4 of these joined forces and crushed the opposition in the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC. They divided the kingdom in 4 pieces. The 2 who would affect life in Palestine were Seleucus, Seleucus, who controlled Syria and a large territory to the east, and Ptolemy, who ruled over the land of Israel and Egypt. That's Ptolemy. Let's talk about the Ptolemaic period. And this takes us, it's Egyptian, and it takes us from 301 to 198 BC. The governors in Egypt at this time were Greek. Ptolemy chose the city of Alexandria as his capital in the delta of the Nile River on the Mediterranean Sea, a city that Alexander himself had founded. The city grew quickly until it became a center of Greek culture, highly respected for its commerce and learning. Ptolemy I, Soter, established the great library of Alexandria that remained for almost 1,000 years. Up until this time, the Jewish people had had little contact with the Greeks, but now Jews went to Egypt in large numbers where they learned Greek and began to appreciate Greek literature and culture. At this time, the land of Israel also went through a process of Hellenization, and the Jews were exposed to the attraction of the Greek lifestyle, its language, its art, the enjoyment of its festivals and games. People frequented amphitheaters and public baths. As long as there was no attempt to attack Jewish religion, the process of Hellenization advanced without violent opposition. But the Seleucids to the north wanted the land of Canaan for themselves, which leads us to the Seleucid period, Syrian. In other words, their headquarters were up in Damascus. And this period takes us from 197 to 167 BC. Let's talk about Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great. Efforts by the Syrians to gain control of Canaan were finally successful. In the Battle of Panias in 198 BC, Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great, defeated Ptolemy V of Egypt. Not long after, Antiochus himself was defeated by the Romans and was forced to pay them tribute. During the reign of his successor, there was an attempt to plunder the treasury of the temple in Jerusalem to pay these tributes. And let's talk about his successor, Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes. The crisis in Israel came under the rule of Antiochus IV. He self-proclaimed himself Epiphanes, which means the illustrious. He wanted to reign over a strong and completely Hellenized state, even in matters of religion. He announced his divinity on his coins, which bore the inscription, "From King Antiochus, manifest God, bearer of victory." Under him, we can talk about several things that were taking place. Let's talk first about the mess with Jason, Onias III, Onias IV, and Menelaus. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, sold the post of high priest to Jason, the brother of Onias III, who was the legitimate high priest. Jason was a devoted Hellenist who introduced Greek festivals and sporting events in Jerusalem. He had a Greek gymnasium built, in Jerusalem, and young men were trained in the Greek lifestyle and, doing their exercises in the nude, which Jews found offensive. The son of Onias III, Onias IV, was so frustrated he went to Leontopolis in southern Egypt, and he established a rival temple there. And that cult remained until the Romans shut it down in AD 72 during the Jewish revolt. In 172 BC, Menelaus outbid Jason for the post of high priest, and he became high priest. He was not a Levite. Second Maccabees says he was from the tribe of Benjamin. So now the position of high priest was fully a political post that did not even conform to the requirements of the law of Moses, which required that the high priest had to be a Levite, not just a Levite, but he had to be a descendant of the family of Aaron. So this leads to two Jewish groups in dispute. Up until this point, the conflict in Judah had only been between Jews. There was a pro-Hellenic group that opposed the conservative Jewish group, and the Jewish group did not approve of the Greek culture. When Antiochus Epiphanes began his efforts, this pro-Hellenic group became more aggressive, knowing that they had the king's backing. They pressured everyone to accept this Greek lifestyle. Those who opposed Hellenization were known as the Hasidim, the pious. These were the predecessors of the Pharisees, and that term is where we get the idea of Hasidic Jews, pious Jews. These were the people trying to defend the Jewish religion and customs and to stop the rising tide of apostasy. The pro-Hellenists enjoyed their position of privilege and were quick to dismiss their Jewish heritage. They tried to curry a favorable political position for Jerusalem and tried to accumulate wealth and power for themselves. But Antiochus IV crystallized the situation in the land of Judah. A first crisis took place when Antiochus Epiphanes was in Egypt. Jason and Menelaus were fighting for the high priesthood, and a conflict broke out between the two factions. When Antiochus heard about the disturbances, he returned quickly, and thinking that there was a rebellion against him in the city, he ordered his army to attack the people and killed a large number of them. Not long after this, he was in Egypt again, fighting the Ptolemies, and he was on the verge of victory. He was about to win when the Romans stopped his attempts at conquest. They sent an emissary who threatened him with Roman reprisals if he destroyed the Ptolemies. So Antiochus returned home, and as he passed through Palestine, he was in a very foul mood. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, a rumor had arrived that Antiochus had died in battle, and they were holding a celebration for his death. Antiochus, you can imagine, was not happy at all. He decided to finish the Hellenization of Palestine by royal decree. The practice of Judaism was abolished. Those who resisted were killed or enslaved. Observance of the Sabbath was forbidden, and so was circumcision. Worship in the temple was forbidden. The scriptures were destroyed. In December of 168 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes confiscated the sacred cups in the temple as well as its treasury. He built a pagan altar on top of the brazen altar and offered pigs on it to desecrate it. And many scholars believe this is what the prophet Daniel refers to as the abomination of desolation. And let's talk then about the Maccabean or Hasmonean period, 167 to 63 BC. Start out talking about Mattathias. When Antiochus IV's brutal reaction took place, some people abandoned the faith, others resisted and died as martyrs. There was one priest named Mattathias who went from Jerusalem to Modin, that's M-O-D-E-I-N, but he found in the city of Modin that the situation was the same there. There was a Greek representative who came and commanded Mattathias to act as a priest guiding the pagan cult. Mattathias refused to comply, and a young man offered to obey the command, but Mattathias got up, killed both the young man and the Greek representative, and then he took his sons and fled to the hillside. This was the spark that ignited the Maccabean revolt. So let's talk about Judas Maccabeus and or the hammer. A revolution broke out, and the Jews were fighting a guerrilla-style warfare. They did not have the troops or the weapons to take to the open battlefield. In the beginning, their enemies attacked on Saturday when they were refusing to fight on religious grounds. But Mattathias encouraged them to fight on the Sabbath, or there'd be no one left to observe Sabbath anyway. So he convinced the people to fight on the Sabbath. Mattathias died, and his son Maccabeus, which is a nickname, which means the hammer, he continued to fight, and he was a bold and able leader. This nickname of Judas, Maccabeus, has come to be used to designate the entire dynasty of leaders during this time, although they are also called Hasmoneans after Mattathias' great-grandfather Hasmon. Both terms refer to the same lineage, Hasmonean or Maccabean. Little by little, the Jews became strong enough to move from guerrilla fighting to the battlefield, and they were able to take Jerusalem back, with the exception of the citadel, which remained under the control of a Syrian garrison. They purified the temple and rededicated it on December 25th of the year 165 BC, or perhaps 164. And this is an event that they were still commemorating in Jesus' time, according to John 10, verses 22 and 23. And Jews today still observe it. This is Hanukkah, the festival of lights. There were internal rivalries in Syria that weakened their efforts against the Jews. So Antiochus IV's general, his name was Lysias, Lysias. He granted religious liberty, and he removed his forces so as to not have to fight on two fronts. This was the goal that the Hasidim, who would later become the Pharisees, this is what they'd been fighting for. So they stopped fighting. They were willing to accept Antiochus IV's rule so long as they could continue to keep their Jewish customs. But the Maccabean leaders were set on gaining political freedom, not just religious freedom, and the fight went on without the help of the Hasidim. Judas Maccabeus appealed to Rome and entered into an agreement, after which Rome sent orders to Syria to leave Judah alone. The orders arrived too late to save the life of Judas, who died in battle, and many of the Jews who died with him in the battle at Elasa. But the torch went on with Jonathan and Simon. Syria was not able to destroy the resistance due to their own internal weaknesses and the external threats from Rome. So Jonathan followed his older brother Judas as leader of the independence movement, and he became high priest in 152 BC. Later, his brother Simon succeeded him in command, and in 142 BC, they finally were able to gain political independence, which lasted more or less 80 years. For the moment, Rome recognized the independence of Judah and did not interfere in its affairs. Simon was declared high priest, commander of the Jewish armed forces, and king. For the first time in Jewish history, one man held all leadership positions, religious, military, and civil. Let's talk about John Hyrcanus. After the death of Simon, his son John Hyrcanus ruled. There were problems at this time. The alliance with Rome didn't show a whole lot of trust in God. Now that they had the power to create their own laws, the anti-Hellenists made no effort to win over the Jewish pro-Hellenist people. These were treated severely, and they were alienated from the cause of the victors. They imposed Judaism on people throughout Judah, and even outside Judah in Samaria and in Idumea, which was ancient Edom. They even used mercenary troops to impose the Jewish lifestyle. And at times they even used them against Jews. Let's talk about Aristobulus I and Alexander Jannaeus. After John Hyrcanus died in 105 BC, his son Aristobulus I ruled for only 1 year. During this time, a group emerged that was a minority but very influential, made up almost exclusively of members of the aristocracy. From these came the Sadducees, who viewed Hellenism favorably and thought that this influence could be embraced without outright abandoning Judaism. There was a strong antagonism developing between this new group and the Pharisees, or the Hasidim. Aristobulus I was a Sadducee, and he was succeeded by Alexander Jannaeus, who was also a Sadducee. And this was a man who treated the Pharisees very harshly. He ruled until his death in 78 BC, and he was succeeded by his wife, Salome Alexandra, who happened to be a staunch Pharisee, not Sadducee. So let's talk about Salome Alexandra and her two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. During the rule of Salome Alexandra, the Pharisees returned the favor. They treated the Sadducees horribly. She had two sons, Hyrcanus II, who was a Pharisee, and Aristobulus II, who was a Sadducee. She thought, how do I unite the country? She decided, well, I will establish Hyrcanus II as high priest, and Aristobulus II I will make the commander of the army. But her plan failed. When Alexandra died, her two sons fought to see who would rule over everything. Hyrcanus II was supported by Antipater, an Idumean military advisor who had counseled his father Alexander Jannaeus. Also Aretas, king of Nabatea, supported him. But Aristobulus II had the army at his command. The fight lasted 6 years, and neither side was able to gain the upper hand. This leads us to the Roman period, 63 BC and onward to throughout the New Testament time. Let's talk about Herod the Great's rise to power. And let's begin with Pompey. Rome had already been spreading out in Egypt and Asia Minor, reaching even to the land of Syria. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey conquered Syria, and he waited to see how the confusion in the territory of Palestine would play out. Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II went to Pompey in Damascus, and each wanted him to establish them, they wanted Rome to establish them as the official governor of Judah. They were embarrassed when they discovered that the people had also sent a delegation rejecting both of them and proposing that they be governed by a high priest as had happened in the past. Pompey in the end chose Hyrcanus II. When Pompey went to Jerusalem, the people were not happy seeing Roman troops in the city, and when Pompey went to the temple area, he encountered an opposition group that supported Aristobulus II. Pompey took the Temple Mount by force, and thousands died in the assault. He entered the Holy of Holies in the temple and desecrated the ceremonial objects. He imposed a heavy tribute on Judah and freed many of the cities that the Maccabees had taken over, placing them under the control of the newly conquered province of Syria. He proclaimed Hyrcanus II high priest. Jewish independence was over. Now they answered to the Roman Empire. Aristobulus II was sent to Rome. Pompey named Antipater of Idumea counselor to Hyrcanus II. Antipater was a great defender of Pompey, and he came to have great influence in the region. This leads to the first triumvirate, Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. In Rome, this first triumvirate, dividing power between Crassus in Italy, Pompey in Syria, and Julius Caesar in Gaul, was dissolving. Crassus died in battle in 53 BC. After his victory in Gaul and the death of Crassus, Julius Caesar felt compelled to take Rome. He crossed the Rubicon River in northern Italy in 49 BC in an event that has become the referent for any decision that marks a person's path in a significant way, kind of a point of no return. The Senate was terrified and asked Pompey for help, but he was forced to leave Italy and establish his base of operations in Greece. Julius Caesar, when he took Rome, freed several war prisoners. Among them, he freed Aristobulus II and sent him back to Palestine to create problems for Pompey. However, those supporting Pompey had no trouble. They killed Aristobulus II, so that didn't lead to anything. But after a defeat in 48 BC, Pompey made the unfortunate decision to seek refuge with Ptolemy XIII of Egypt, his young 13-year-old protege. The young king had just sent away his sister, Cleopatra VII. She was 21 years old at the time, and she's the notorious Cleopatra we know from history books and film. She had been co-regnant with him, and he had followed the Ptolemaic practice of taking his sister as his wife. As soon as Ptolemy put to shore in Africa, people sent by the child Ptolemy XIII killed him. Julius Caesar arrived on a boat pursuing Pompey and took over Alexandria, taking Cleopatra VII as his concubine and putting Ptolemy XIII in prison. But Julius Caesar underestimated the strong Egyptian nationalism, and he found himself trapped in the Greek zone of Alexandria, surrounded by Egyptians. Although Caesar freed Ptolemy XIII to try to appease them, the situation did not improve. The boy simply took command of the Egyptian army that surrounded Julius Caesar. Which leads us to go back to Antipater again. Caesar sent messengers requesting the support of his troops back in Greece, but they were too far away. It takes too long to get all the way around. He was saved by an unlikely person. Antipater, who had been made counselor to Hyrcanus II by Pompey, he heard of Pompey's death and Julius Caesar's desperate situation and decided to intervene. He combined a friendly influence with his Syrian neighbors and a quick intervention with mercenary Jewish troops and pressure on the important Jewish sector in Alexandria, and he contributed to Julius Caesar's victory at a critical moment. He freed him so that he could continue his path to imperial domination. As thanks to Antipater, Julius Caesar made some important changes in Judah. He named the high priest Hyrcanus II ethnarch, restoring him to a political rank, not simply a religious rank. He lightened the tribute and returned some territories to them and exempted them from military service due to their Sabbath laws. They were granted freedoms to practice their religion, even were allowed to pay offerings to the temple. Julius Caesar raised the rank of Antipater of Idumea and granted him Roman citizenship, a highly prized privilege that was tied to the city of Rome, not to the Roman state. And he made him procurator, placed him in charge of Judah. Now Hyrcanus II did not answer to the Caesar, he answered to Antipater. It was very difficult for the Jewish people to accept the governance of their rivals from centuries past, the Edomites, who had so often served under the Jewish people in centuries past, and who only recently, under John Hyrcanus I, had been forced to accept the Jewish religion by force. Hyrcanus II now became Antipater's puppet. And let's talk about Herod the Great and Phasael. One of Antipater's sons, Herod the Great, was placed in charge of Galilee as an adolescent, and he demonstrated such a remarkable administrative ability that he earned even the praise of the Roman authorities. His brother Phasael was placed in charge of Judea. So let's talk then about the second triumvirate, Mark Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus. So meanwhile, back in Rome, after the death of Julius Caesar, the second triumvirate was formed. Mark Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus. Mark Antony took Asia as his sphere. And let's talk about Antigonus and the Parthians resisting Herod and Phasael. Jewish nobles tried to get Mark Antony to remove Herod and Phasael from ruling over them, but he denied their request. So then they backed Antigonus, the only child remaining of the deceased Aristobulus II, son of Salome Alexandra. They asked for help from the Parthians to the east, who came to Jerusalem demanding that the sons of Antipater, Herod and Phasael, as well as Hyrcanus II, in other words, all those who had a possible claim to the governorship of Judea, they called a meeting to meet them. Herod smelled a trap, and he fled to Rome, where he obtained the explicit support of Antony, Octavius, and the Roman Senate. The Senate named him king of Judea, though at the moment it was true in name only. The Parthians took control of the Roman region of Palestine from 40 to 39 BC. Phasael found himself surrounded in Jerusalem and committed suicide. Herod, king of Judea. So Herod was able to marry Mariamne, that's Mariamne. She was a beautiful woman, and she was the granddaughter of Aristobulus II through her father Alexander, and also of Hyrcanus II through her mother Alexandra, which now tied Herod to the Maccabeans. He was able, with the help of Rome, to take back Jerusalem and kill Antigonus. Antigonus had been supported by the Sadducees, so Herod appealed to the Pharisees and was able to win their favor. He was very skillful in keeping the right people happy without offending their strong religious beliefs, while at the same time maintaining an absolute loyalty to Rome. When the second triumvirate was dissolved and Antony and Octavius faced off, this placed Herod in a difficult position. Herod had been Antony's friend, but their friendship was hurt when Antony, under Cleopatra VII's spell, yes, the same Cleopatra, kept giving her more and more of Herod's territories. Even then, when Antony went to war against Octavius, Herod was willing to support him, but he was unable because Cleopatra would not allow it. When Antony died and Octavius won the battle in 27 BC and adopted for himself the name Augustus, Herod found himself on the losing side. But he was able to appeal candidly to Octavius, and he didn't hide his love for Antony, but he convinced him he'd be equally loyal to him as he had been to Antony. In his personal life, Herod went from bad to worse. It seems he loved Mariamne deeply, but based on false reports of her infidelity, he had her killed. His remorse for this almost drove him mad, and his health was failing. He recovered to a certain extent and actually lived to be 70 years old, but the rest of his life was marked by suspicion and bloodshed. He had a total of 10 wives, and he killed anybody who threatened him, even members of his own family. He had his son Aristobulus put to death in 7 BC. He set out on an ambitious public construction plan and was one of the greatest builders of the Roman era. He tried to gain the favor of the Jews by rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. He built a theater in Jerusalem and an amphitheater. His palace in Jerusalem was especially splendid. He practically rebuilt Samaria and named it Sebaste, which means August, the title Octavius had chosen for himself. Even so, Herod lost the support of the Pharisees more and more, and of the people in general, and he turned cruel and bitter. The final years of Herod were years of suffering and madness. He had a horrible sickness in his body that made his bed a rotting lair. He died in 4 BC, 2 years after Jesus was born, and his cruelty is evident in his order to have all male children in Bethlehem killed. He died unloved by his subjects. Despite many mistakes, Herod provided Judah with a time of peace, and he was able to keep the Roman Empire from coming in to impose order. He was able to protect the religious liberty of the Jews. Just as a final thing to help you keep names straight and figure out how things are connected, I've included, I have a printout of it here, a little table to kind of put a little bit of information with each of the names in the Hasmonean or the Maccabean dynasty. So under Mattathias, at the very top, you might put something like the priest who in Modin killed Antiochus IV's representative and sparked the Maccabean revolt. Then with his 3 sons, Judas Maccabeus, you could say that he was nicknamed the Hammer, and he was able to rededicate the temple, which led to Hanukkah and won religious liberty for the Jews. Under Jonathan, you could just say that he succeeded his brother Judas. Under Simon, you could also add that he gained political independence in 143 BC and was named high priest and military and civil leader. Then Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, you could say that he ruled harshly over the pro-Hellenic elements in Jewish life. He used mercenary troops to impose the Jewish religion in Idumea, which was ancient Edom. And then John Hyrcanus's 2 sons, Aristobulus I, you could say that under him Sadducees arose, a pro-Hellenic aristocratic group, and that Aristobulus was one of those. You could also, with Alexander Jannaeus, you could say that he succeeded his brother, and he too was a Sadducee. And then his wife, Salome Alexandra, under her you could put that she succeeded her husband Alexander and was a Pharisee and supported their interests. And then her 2 children, Hyrcanus II, you could say he was a Pharisee named high priest by his mother, Alexandra. He was supported by the counselor Antipater, who was an Idumean, and he was finally able to govern in Judea under Antipater's authority when the Romans established that. Then Aristobulus II, You could say he was a Sadducee. He was named general over the Jewish army by his mother Alexandra, and though he fought to control Judea, he was finally killed, and Antipater and Hyrcanus II are the ones who ruled.